I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Recently, when Maryland State Delegate Kathleen Dumais left her District 15 seat in Montgomery County to join the Circuit Court as judge, the Montgomery County Democratic Party appointed its chair, Linda Foley, to fill the position. This led to questions about whether the appointment process was truly open and democratic. In a set of tweets, Amy Frieder, a Democratic Party activist who was also a candidate for appointment, complained about the process favoring insiders. This is an old complaint in Maryland and in Montgomery County. A third of the county state delegation came into office first through this vacancy appointment process. I talked to County State Delegate from District 20, David Moon, about his efforts to reform the vacancy process.
I have accepted all that you've done, girl. I kept the home you neglected, baby, while you was out having fun.
If you are new to the show, I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. It is my hope that this podcast will help those who feel left out reconnect in our local communities.
And as our children grew older, well, honey, so did my pain. So did my pain. Baby, it's good.
Music for this episode comes from DC area Southern soul band King Soul. Tom Clifford and Jake Flack on vocals, Mark Noon on bass, Arif Durrani on keyboards, Ben Holmes on drums, Chris Watling on sax, Matt Ripito on tenor sax, and Vince McCall on the trumpet. Don't miss them on New Year's Eve at Clyde's in Chevy Chase. The news roundup this week with a startler from the north. Frederick County Public School Superintendent Terry Alban has been placed on administrative leave following a U.S. Department of Justice investigation that found Frederick School District used seclusion and restraint 7,235 times on 125 students with disabilities over a 2.5-year period. Let me repeat. Frederick Public Schools, as a matter of policy, routinely secluded and restrained students with severe disabilities such as autism in violation of federal law. Superintendent Alban is a product of the Maryland Public Schools system. She has served in several districts around the state over her career. Closer home, Todd Watkins, the Director of Transportation for Montgomery County Public Schools, and a deputy were put on administrative leave pending investigation of charges that school district credit cards were overcharged. Watkins was at the center of a large deal to electrify over 300 MCPS school buses that was touted by the county and the school district as being cost neutral. A 19-year-old man was stabbed in downtown Silver Spring at 11:30 a.m. on December 7th. Following a knife fight, he died. There's been growing concern about the rise of crime especially centered on Silver Spring. Crime is up nationally and in the Washington DMV area in 2021. In Montgomery County, the problem of crime has not been its high incidence, but rather the discriminatory treatment of residents of color by the police and the justice system. This recent uptick, however, has sent residents and political leaders toward tough-on-crime positions. County Council member from the Silver Spring area and now candidate for county executive Tom Hucker claimed on Facebook that he had been predicting this would happen for over a year. We have several political process items leading into the interview with Delegate David Moon on vacancy appointments. To editorialize just a bit, one reason politics can be alienating is that doing politics requires elaborate rules and processes. Every aspect of human activity has elaborate process rules. Think about rules governing kids' sports and the multi-page documents we sign off on when we send our kids to play on a soccer field. Processes and rules have to evolve as circumstances change. But of course, some rules are seen as forever rules. The U.S. Constitution is treated by many as unchangeable, even though it explicitly provides a system of amendments, which of course have become harder because our politics themselves have shifted. These debates are well known on the national stage, but less so in local politics. This week, the Montgomery County Council introduced a bill to fix the public finance system for elections. Montgomery County is one of the few municipal governments that has an extensive system of public financing for candidates running in local elections. The public finance law is pretty detailed and has enabled many candidates to consider running when they might not have without that law. Yet it is not perfect. As it turned out, public finance law, determined as it was to separate conventional election financing from public financing, created a situation where political parties could not distribute literature on behalf of candidates that received public financing. This is a worm's eye view problem of a worm's eye view. So Montgomery County Bill 4521 is going to allow up to $10,000 in-kind donation from political parties to public finance candidates. $10,000 seems like a lot of money, but in fact, it is just a measure of the time value for the party to hand out candidate literature for publicly financed candidates. At this point, if you are still interested, you are a political nerd. If you tuned out, let me help bring you back with this. Without this fix of the law, seemingly obvious and probably to be taken for granted, public finance candidates are at a disadvantage because their political party can happily hand out literature on behalf of candidates that did not receive public financing, thereby lending greater support to conventionally financed candidates. Defeats the entire purpose of public finance, don't you think? Redistricting is a big process issue. Montgomery County Council approved new district lines this week, accepting most of the work of the Redistricting Commission it had appointed, with some changes to the Kemp, Mill, and Clarksburg areas. The only county council member to vote no on the new lines was Andrew Friedson. At the state level, the Maryland General Assembly okayed new congressional districts that will ensure that the state delegation to Congress remains 7-1 in favor of Democrats. Governor Hogan is expected to veto. The General Assembly is expected to override the veto. The theater is likely to continue if the governor decides to take this to court. He has said that he will. This week's big interview with David Moon needs some background as well. First, people in public offices leave their offices all the time. Sometimes public office holders die while they are in office. Montgomery County Board of Education member Pat O'Neill died this fall, and the position was filled by the Board of Education via an application and interview process. The rest of her term will be filled by Bethesda area education consultant Scott Joftis. Once the term ends, Joftis can choose to run for re-election. Almost all organizations, and certainly all governing bodies have some succession planning. In Maryland, different organizations and bodies vary in their vacancy processes. The process for Congress in Maryland is special elections, which is really different from the process for appointing legislators who leave the General Assembly. And there are differences between counties. Why do we really care about all of this? The obvious answer is that the process determines who fills the vacancy. Once a vacancy is filled, the person is now considered the incumbent and gains big incumbency advantages such as name recognition. And in Montgomery County, at least, incumbents tend to run together as informal teams, if not as formally registered slates. But in Maryland, General Assembly, legislators cannot fundraise during the legislative session. So a person who fills the vacancy, say in December of a year prior to a primary, as Linda Foley was recently appointed, she will not be able to fundraise until mid-April. And that leaves very little time for her to be prepared for the primary in June. Lawmakers are acutely aware of this disadvantage. Second, Democratic Majority Leader Eric Lutke, delegate from District 14 in Montgomery County, argued on Twitter that the vacancy appointment process, in fact, has brought increased racial representation in the legislature. This is true. A third of all Montgomery County state delegation first came into office via vacancy appointments. You could look at this and go glass half full or glass half empty. In order for the party to appoint someone, that person must be an insider. And the more insider you are, the better. In Linda Foley's case, she was the chair of the Democratic Party in the county. And if there is a case of a facial minority being appointed, that person also needs to be connected intimately to the party. There is political science to this, and you will hear that in my discussion with David Moon. I'll be back with him in just a minute.
Just how long it's been from the day you walked out on your family till you walk right back in. And in this world full of sorrow, you left me just half a man.
David Moon, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thanks for having me.
Recently, Montgomery County Democratic Central Committee appointed its chair, Linda Foley, as the delegate for the District 15 vacancy opened up by Kathleen Dumais' appointment to the Circuit Court. And that has caused some amount of controversy about how the vacancy process should work. In 2015, you had introduced a bill to reform the process. Can you start and tell us what problem you were trying to solve and what the bill would do?
When I first got elected, I put a bill in that basically would have said if someone dies or resigns from office before their term expires, that in the House or Senate in Maryland, that would go immediately to a special election, within a few weeks, most. And that's in contrast to our current system, where basically the party from the county of the departing official recommends someone to the governor, and that person then gets chosen. So there's no election under the current system. If there's a vacancy, the party chooses essentially someone to represent the balance of the term for the voters of that district.
What problem were you trying to solve?
I think it's fair to say people like choosing their elected officials. And so for me, as a foundational principle, voters having a say over who represents them, seems to me a basic concept I was trying to uphold.
There's also some sort of downstream consequences, right? So somebody that is appointed has the benefits of incumbency in the next election. Is that correct?
There are many dimensions to this issue. And, when I started in 2015, the bill I put in was immediately to go to a special election. And in later years, when I put the bill in, I had moved somewhere towards putting in a bill that said, all right, we're going to continue to have a temporary appointment. But that can't last for, 3 years or 3.5 years. If we're already having an election during that period and we're already paying to conduct it, well, you got to add that vacancy to the ballot. So the appointment only lasts until the next election that we're already paying for. So one reason I moved to this is that where I failed to get this passed for the House of Delegates or the State Senate, I succeeded in getting that reform passed for Attorney General, Comptroller, and the U.S. Senate. So essentially, for all the statewide offices now, we have a vacancy procedure, as I just described, a temporary appointment by the party that's followed by a special election if we're already paying to conduct an election.
So we have different methodologies for doing different offices. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I've been slowly trying to bring some uniformity to this chaos one by one. So let me just, start you off for what this sounds like. The governor, if he or she were to die in office, would be succeeded by the lieutenant governor. In the U.S. House, we go immediately to a special election. For the U.S. Senate, we have a temporary appointment by the state party, and they submit 3 names. The governor chooses one of those 3 names. But again, that appointment only lasts until the next election we're already paying to conduct. So between the House and the Senate, I can say this. A U.S. Senate term is 6 years. A U.S. House term is 2 years. So if your U.S. House member dies and you don't want that local district to go without a representative, you might have a election immediately because the whole term is only 2 years. So if someone's dead for 9 months, that's actually a substantial amount of the term to go unrepresented. For U.S. Senate, well, under the old system, you would have had the governor appointing someone, but that appointment could last quite some time. And so, with a 6-year term, making that person run on the next ballot, I think it strikes a pretty fair compromise.
But that's also different from how the state legislature works.
Well, the state legislature only got so far as having the appointment done by the same party as the outgoing official. And so, again, where I started was in 2015 to say, all right, let's do this like U.S. House and go immediately to an election. And that raised all sorts of objections. It did with U.S. Senate, too. First and foremost is if you have an election where the only thing on the ballot is a measly House of Delegates race, and I say this as a member of the House of Delegates, the concern is who's going to turn out for that election. Traditionally, the turnout for a single race special election is exceedingly low. I was the campaign manager for Nancy Navarro in 2 back-to-back special elections in Montgomery County almost a decade ago. And, those races had turnout of maybe 10%. So, this is the problem. If you solve one problem, you're going to create another in elections. There's a famous theorem, Arrow's theorem, which would, posit that there's no perfect electoral system, that it's a series of values you have to choose. And, some of them are zero sum. And I think herein lies a perfect example of this. What's more important? Accuracy of representation, and you do that potentially by having greater turnout, or voters having a say at all. So this is actually at the heart of the history of changes to Maryland's vacancy system. In fact, when I proposed immediately I believe in 2015, Barbara Mikulski was in her 80s, And so I put in a bill, and we had a Republican governor. And at the time, the special vacancy procedure for U.S. Senate said the governor chooses. Well, I took a look at that and I said, that doesn't seem very fair if Maryland elects in overwhelming margins a Democratic U.S. senator. And so we switched it. But it took me 2 tries. The first time I tried, I said, let's go directly to a special election. And people pointed to Scott Brown in Massachusetts, where with a single shot election, you could have 10% turnout and have a very different result than you would have if everyone turned out, say, with presidential level turnout. And so after my bill failed, I brought it back the next year. And this time I brought the method that was adopted, which is a temporary appointment by the same party as the outgoing official. And at the next election, the next high turnout election that you're already paying for, you have a special election. So that was the compromise that Maryland has gravitated towards.
So it seems that you were able to gather support in the legislature for the change for the statewide offices, but not for state legislative offices.
There are those who believe we should go immediately to a special election. There are those who believe we should retain a pure appointment process. And there are any number of combinations of opinions in between. Some would argue that the central committees themselves need to adopt more transparent and uniform processes. How Baltimore conducts its vacancies is very different from how Montgomery County does, for example.
How so?
So every county has a party central committee. So the Democrats and the Republicans have an elected set of members from that county that runs on the same ballot as the governor and delegates and senators. And when the vacancies occur, those people choose. However, as that has devolved into different county by county differences, Baltimore City, for example, gives basically the power to appoint to the central committee members from the district of the outgoing delegate and senator. So in Montgomery County, we have 8 legislative districts, 24 delegates, and 8 senators. When there's a vacancy from one of those Montgomery County Senate or delegate seats, the entire county's worth of elected Democratic Central Committee officials would choose that vacancy. And some would say, what's a Potomac, party official doing choosing a Silver Spring delegate? And so Baltimore has done it the opposite of Montgomery County and basically has the district members do it. But that leads to its own sets of questions when you might have a very, 4 people making the decision. It's very easy to have a tie, and it's easy to see how you could have concern about conflicts and whether the accurate representation was being chosen by 2 people. So this is, again, to say there's just lots of ways to do it. There's tons of variation how it's currently done in the state, and a million opinions. And I've actually come to believe there's merit to all sides of the debate, and we really need to talk through what makes sense for Maryland.
Okay. Can we speak to the politics of it? How does the politics of this play out?
It's not very clean. I would say every time we have a vacancy in the delegate or the Senate that's contested, someone is going to lose. And so, chalk it up to that basic fact, the zero-sum nature of politics and appointments. That means people will be critical of the process one way or another. And so you've got folks who feel the Central Committee making appointments is undemocratic, even more so when Central Committee members run themselves for the appointments, as is often the case. But on the other end of it, I want to give fairness to the other side. And so there's a very real concern that if we do away with the appointment process, you might hinder the ability for racial and ethnic minorities and other underrepresented groups to have a shot if the existing political structure somehow hasn't pulled candidates from those groups through in the past. And for whatever reason, maybe in Montgomery County, for example, we've had multiple African American delegates in our first senator come through the appointment process, where in many of those districts it previously had not been done. In fact, Montgomery County had not had an African American senator, and I happened to be the candidate on the other side of that race, and it was a proud moment for my senator. And so I am very sensitive to that issue. And when you then come up with the possibility of delegates being appointed in, and again, these would be new faces, if they're from the Central Committee or hadn't been in office before, they get sworn in through this process. If they immediately have to run in a special election, but they were in Annapolis from January to April, you can't fundraise during that period. And many appointees have pointed to this as a fatal flaw in these special election efforts that would seriously, they think, unfairly give competition an advantage over them. So that's another challenge we have to work through.
So one side says that the vacancy system is anti-democratic, and the other side says that the vacancy system, in fact, fixes some of the anti-democratic nature of elections themselves. Is that the breakdown now between them?
I think whether the outcome is democratic is different from whether the process is democratic. And I think this is the problem. What's a fair process? If the county is 50% minority, but somehow the delegates and senators are not, anywhere close to that population level, well, one could criticize the outcomes and say that process is not leading to a fair outcome. Another could say, well, damn the outcomes. The voters have to have a say. And even if only 10% of people turn out and you have a bizarre outcome like a Republican U.S. senator in an overwhelmingly Democratic state, some would say, well, the voters had the opportunity to have their say. And so, interestingly enough, the current process was actually Maryland's controversial process of party appointments for delegate and Senate came in the 1930s in a progressive era push in the state, where the concern was over whether a low turnout special election would give you accuracy of representation. So this dynamic, this debate, it's nothing new. We're rehashing it, but in a different context, in a different time. What's right and what's democratic looks different to one group versus another.
Well, our demographics have changed significantly from, 1930s. So, should the process also change?
Well, I'd like to think I was beginning to push the conversation towards a realm of compromise, which I really did think, like, if we have the Central Committee next to temporary appointment, it really preserves the opportunity to get someone in swiftly without a low turnout election. You don't have the district being without a voice for some time. But as soon as we could guarantee a high turnout election, there would be the opportunity for voters to have a say. I thought that was a pretty good compromise, but I actually do think the peculiarities of Maryland's campaign finance prohibitions does create an added wrinkle. So notably, the Maryland Senate voted that reform out. It was unanimous. The Maryland Senate voted that reform out unanimously, and the House wasn't able to get it done. But part of the pushback that was given to me from some of my colleagues in the House is that many of the senators who are going to get appointed in were delegates previously. And so they're known to the voters. They probably already have a campaign account with funds. And so they can afford to skip 90 days of fundraising and go immediately into an election without worry that somehow they're going to be unfairly harmed, where I think you really are going to get many more brand new faces who get swiftly appointed in and then have to legislate for 90 days, can't fundraise, and then turn around only to have someone who's been fundraising the whole time. Now, I can't comment on which is the bigger problem, but I can say, as a matter of getting this passed, we have to figure out a way to address that concern. I think if we're going to have this thing advance any further in Annapolis.
Have you thought about that?
It's really difficult to do. The easiest way is to shorten the circumstances under which a special election is triggered. So this is what I mean. If the legislative session starts January to April, and that's when the fundraising prohibition is, in one version of this reform, we said, all right, if the vacancy happens in the first year of a 4-year term, then that vacancy goes to a special election on the second year ballot. And you need time to hold a primary, you need time to print ballots and have a candidate filing deadline. So you can't just say we're going to have the election tomorrow. You need a minimum of, I forget the 30, 60, 90 days, but there's a minimum amount of time. So one suggestion has been, okay, maybe then we only have an election if the vacancy happens in the first 9 months of a 4-year term. And then at least you cover some scenarios, but no one can complain because at least an appointee will have 3 or 4 months to fundraise before the session starts to sort of catch up to where they think they need to be. But you can imagine the other opponents to the bill are those who believe we should go immediately to a special election in every single circumstance. And so for that group, something like a special election only happening if a vacancy occurs in the first 9 months of a 4-year term is not a satisfying solution.
Are there any secondary objections to the idea that we should have special elections, whether within a time frame or not?
Low turnout, high cost for the election. There are those who also believe the current process is not flawed, and it's not flawed in the sense that we don't have an election and we have an appointment. And they believe that reform of the central committees and how the central committees conduct elections could alleviate some of the concerns. And I've heard everything from have people only pledge to serve as a caretaker and not actually run. We've had other people suggest that central committee members shouldn't be allowed to run for the appointments, or if they should resign from the committee and not vote on their own appointment. We have other people that have suggested requirements for debates and a formal process for central committees. And, again, each county does it differently. And this is not just a problem in Democratic circles. The Republicans have equal debates about central committees versus special elections. When Governor Hogan first won election as governor, one of the things he did was choose a cabinet that included members of the House and Senate. And so it was a wave of Republican appointments that were happening, accompanied by a wave of regional controversies and discussions about the appointment process happening in Republican counties. And that was in the first year or so of Hogan's term. And so I think now with an open governor's race and an open governor's seat, for certain, we're going to have a wave of appointments in the first year of whoever the next governor's term is. And we're going to have this conversation all over again.
In Montgomery County, I've heard that 1/3 of the Montgomery County delegation came in through the appointment process rather than from elections the first time. What do you think that does to the politics of Montgomery County?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that's pretty consistent, I think, throughout the state. typically I think 20% to 30% of the assembly came into their first office through an appointment. And look, one of the things it's done in Montgomery, it has allowed unlikely voices to serve, in the sense that we hadn't had an African American senator from Montgomery County. So that's one very clear effect you could point to. I think it also creates different lanes of politics. It's a little bit unexpected. You can have folks who are newer to the political scene, I suppose, come in. You could have folks that are old hats to the political scene come in. And so I think the Central Committee swims in the same direction in every county as their party politics, but not 100%. And so I would say we see in multiple districts in Montgomery and elsewhere a diversity of opinion that comes in this way. But again, it also means that you have to sacrifice something else. And here it's that, you might be in a scenario where people who have run on the ballot before are losing appointment processes. And so, it's an ongoing challenge.
I don't see how somebody truly new, can come in through the appointment process. The appointment process is primarily about relationships, right? The appointment process is not about winning an election.
Well, it's primarily about relationships with your fellow Central Committee members.
Correct. And that too. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you have a situation now where the chair of the Central Committee is being appointed. And there are obviously arguments for and against, right? One, it seems if the chair is being appointed, on the one hand, it seems an inside game too much, right? On the other hand, the argument that I think Linda Foley has made quite effectively is that she has put in the work building the political support base in order to be able to get this appointment, even as chair. So why shouldn't she?
Well, that's an interesting point. And so, in politics, there's only one there's only one route, and that's the one that gets you into the seat. And so, people can play all the imaginary avenues and the woulda, coulda, shouldas, or the what ifs. But if you can play the process as it's currently outlined in law, more power to you. There are those of us who are trying to change that process, but you're absolutely right. It's not a bad skill. I don't want to put any aspersions on the skills one needs to succeed in a Central Committee process versus a potentially different skill set one needs to succeed in an election. They are both skills, and they are both useful in the world of policy and politics. And so I think you're right. There's definitely something to that. One who is nimble at navigating in a 24-person, 32-person scenario, as these committees are often constructed, can be very successful. I mean, in some instances, in say Baltimore, again, I'll point out that we're talking about 4 or 6 people, and so the universe narrows even more there. And frankly, those controversies have played out in all sorts of different ways. Hogan made them take back, one of the Republican Central Committees take back a name they submitted. And this is how we got Senator Justin Reedy appointed, I believe out of Carroll County. Central Committee originally sent a different name, and there was a little bit of a political standoff, and it got reversed. So
what does this say about incumbency and the importance of incumbency? If a third of the delegation is coming in through the appointment process rather than an election process, I mean, incumbency and its legacy is just incredible. It's like people are waiting around for positions to become vacant before they can get their shot at this.
Well, I think that's one way of looking at it. There's definitely appointees who do not succeed in the subsequent election. We had some very capable colleagues of mine on judiciary for whom this was true. My friend Angela Gibson in Baltimore was appointed and defeated in the following primary. My friend Carlos Sanchez was appointed out of Prince George's and defeated in the subsequent primary. And these were very capable, serious legislators who had been around in the scene and, ran real campaigns, but got knocked out. So it does happen. It's not a perfect scenario that incumbency always wins. But I will say one of the things that might amp up that scenario in Maryland is at least in many counties, we have 3-member districts. And so it's not just that you have an appointee who comes in. They're going to typically come in and if they get along with their fellow district mates, you're running as a state senate and 2 or 3 member delegate team. And so you've got, a little bit of cushion of party support and mutual aid happening that makes the incumbency for someone who just got there quite a bit stronger. So again, my friend Carlo had less of that because, it was a single member district vacancy. So you're a little bit on your own when something like that happens. And so, I just point to that as an example. And again, we don't have 3-member districts throughout Maryland. So it's a very local and specific dynamic for how this stuff plays out.
Are you going to bring your bill back? What is going on legislatively with this?
I don't think I'm going to bring it back in the coming year. I'd like to think through how this campaign finance issue works. But in the meantime, it seems like we're at a little bit of a stall in the House. We've had pretty strident opposition coming in against the reform bills that have been moving from folks who insist that it be a direct special election and nothing else. So there are folks who are going to oppose the bill if it allows any appointment, even temporary, whatsoever. And so with that setup, folks coming in and opposing the bill because they want only pure special elections. We have other folks who want to retain the current system to preserve perceived route for minority representation. I think right now the Senate has been able to get their bill through. I believe Senator Lamb is putting his bill in again. So I expect if they pass it, it's going to come over to the House, and the House will have to see if it can find its way in the midst of a redistricting year to also crack the nut on vacancy reform.
Oh, you didn't mention the R word now. David Moon, good luck in this session. Thank you for coming on the show.
So good to have you back again. And I have accepted. Well, I have accepted. Well, I have accepted.
What lessons can we draw from my conversation with David Moon? First, there is no perfect electoral system, or even more broadly, a perfect system of fair representation in government. No matter what vacancy strategy we come up with, there will always be drawbacks. And different folks will focus on different advantages and disadvantages. For a legislative body such as the Maryland General Assembly to come to a policy choice, it is not enough that it has a Democratic supermajority. There are compromises to be made still. David Moon is correct in pointing out the differences between process fairness and outcome fairness. Those who want immediate special elections following a vacancy want process fairness. Those who want vacancy appointments point to the outcome fairness of the process in bringing new faces forward. There are even those who argue that process fairness will eventually lead to outcome fairness. But in the case of Maryland legislative offices, this means fixing the campaign finance law. So, in order to fix the vacancy problem, we must first fix campaign finance, which might very well be a bigger problem. So, do we want the tail to wag the dog now? A limited possible fix to the vacancy problem requires limiting the problem to where the politics are. David Moon has received criticism not only from those who want to preserve the vacancy appointment process, but also from those that want to dismantle it fully. This latter criticism, I believe, has discouraged him from trying to bring back a vacancy reform bill in 2022. Nobody likes compromises, and yet in political science, we have an incredible word to describe it: satisfice. SATISFICE, meaning a position that no one is entirely happy with, but one with which people can live with, even grudgingly. That's a quality of politics increasingly absent nationally, but it is how I think local politics still works. Ask around. Very few people are happy with what's going on in their local politics, but what are they going to do about it? Hence the 10% voter turnout in municipal elections. It ain't perfect, but it allows us to disengage and go home for dinner. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from DC area Southern soul band King Soul. Tom Clifford and Jake Flack on vocals, Mark Noon on bass, Arif Durrani on keyboards, Ben Holmes on drums, Chris Watling on sax, Matt Ripito on tenor sax, and Vince McCall on trumpet. Don't miss them this New Year's Eve at Clyde's in Chevy Chase. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. See you next time.